Good morning, everyone. It is Sunday, November the 8th. I'm coming to you from the church office. For those of you that missed the church office, you can see the beautiful tan-colored paint that we have behind me, and hopefully you enjoy it during today's message. This Wednesday is a special day. It is Veterans Day on November the 11th, and so just wanted to thank all the veterans out there for your service. We know that you're making big sacrifices or have made big sacrifices, and we have our appreciation to you. So let's dive into today's message. So we have been in COVID for around 10 months now, and I'm sure that some of you have picked up some new hobbies, some new habits, maybe even learned some new skills. I know that baking and walking, exercising and reading are pretty common and popular things that people are doing. I myself started picking up cutting hair again. I learned how to cut hair when I was 14 and stopped doing it after grad school. But due to COVID, just not getting haircuts, started picking that up again. So maybe some of you have picked up some skills yourself. My wife, Amy, as some of you or many of you know, started watching Korean dramas. I'm not sure how many of you got sucked into that. I actually at first was pretty not excited about it. I'd walk by and go, this is kind of interesting. I'm not sure exactly what the interest is there, but slowly over time got sucked into it. And so actually started enjoying it. I actually heard from the news that one of the band members of a Korean pop group named BTS actually learned how to speak English by watching TV shows. In this case, it was Friends. There was 10 seasons worth. He watched the whole first season, all 10 seasons actually, first with Korean subtitles. Then he went through the whole thing again with just English subtitles. And the third time around, he actually watched it with no subtitles. And so I thought maybe I could learn some Korean by doing some of the similar things. I utterly failed. After watching, I'd say, over 100 hours of Korean dramas with Amy, I am nowhere closer to learning the language at all. And so I myself never thought I'd be a binge watcher on anything. Like, I don't really follow that many television series. But in this case, I guess I'm guilty of that. And so today is actually a little bit interesting. The reason why I bring up binge watching is because Matthew chapter 13 is just full of parables. And so for any of you that like to binge watch, in this particular case, binge watching on parables is actually something that you could do right here. So in Matthew chapter 13, there's the parable of the mustard seed and the yeast. There's the parable of the net. There's the parable of the hidden treasure and pearl. There's the parable of the sower. But today we're going to focus on the parable of the weeds. I'd just like to point out that in this parable, the term weeds and tares is used interchangeably. So tares is a specific kind of weed that is being referenced in this parable. So I may be using the word tares throughout the parable. So let's read Matthew chapter 13, verse 24 to 30. I'll be reading it through the New International Version. It reads in verse 24, Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he replied. The servants asked him, Do you want us to go and pull them up? No, he answered, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. So in this case, we're talking about wheat that looks like weeds and weeds that look like wheat. It's kind of, first of all, the question is, is it really that hard to tell apart? Well, the parable states that it is. And when I tried to do some Google image searches, it was really hard to kind of tell what was really, I know what wheat looks like, but I didn't really know what a tare looked like. And so generally speaking, these are the kinds of pictures that I saw when I was doing my research. And the parable states that you could hardly tell them apart, especially when they were younger. And so when I looked up some of the pictures, they were more green. Like I think these are a little bit more mature. As you can tell, you could start to see some differences. But when they were on the greener side, it was definitely really hard to take a look. I was just looking at my own life, and personally, I actually think that this is quite believable because something similar happened to my family. And so Amy, my wife, she always kind of accuses herself of not being a very good gardener, and she doesn't think she has a green thumb at all. And so one year she was given a perennial and took care of it that year. As many of you know, a perennial is a plant that comes back every year. And so in this case, every spring, this perennial will regrow and mature. And so after the season was over and the next year came about, she actually saw that her perennial was starting to sprout again. And she was very pleased because she didn't think that it would survive. And she nursed it day after day, making sure that it was in the sun. This was outside. This was not an indoor plant. This was an outdoor plant. And so she made sure it was watered. She made sure that the sun was shining at the right angle. And over the next couple of weeks, if not months, the plant actually grew to around 3 feet tall. And she was very, very pleased and very, very proud of herself. And then one day, a good friend comes over to the house and points out this plant that Amy's been taking care of for the last couple of weeks, if not months, and says, why are you having this weed grow in your pot in the backyard? And at that point, Amy actually realized that what she was nurturing and taking care of all this time was actually a weed, and it was not a plant in itself. So unfortunately, the perennial did die and did not survive the winter, and what was actually growing was a weed. So in even my own personal experience, I can now believe that people really have difficulty kind of differentiating weeds from the actual plant that they're trying to grow. So in this case, as you all know, parables are not meant to be taken literally, where Jesus is giving actual gardening advice or giving tips on how to have a greener thumb, but there actually is an interpretation of this parable and that there's a deeper meaning. In this case, the disciples also knew that there was a deeper meaning to this as well. And so later in the chapter, in verses 36 to 43, the disciples actually asked Jesus, what does this parable mean? And so I actually took Jesus's interpretation and I put it directly into the body of the verses here. So I'll read it again, but this time calling out the interpretations that Jesus put into the passage. So starting in verse 24, it reads, Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man. And in this case, Jesus indicates that this man is the Son of Man. So it's Jesus himself who sowed good seed. The seed in this case is the people of the kingdom. And in his field, which was the world. So the Son of Man put people of the kingdom into the world. But as you can see in verse 25, while everyone was sleeping, his enemy, in this case, he actually defined the enemy as the devil, came and sowed weeds. In this case, the weeds represent people of the evil one among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he replied. The servants asked him, Do you want us to go and pull them up? No, he answered, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. Jesus determines that the harvest represents the end of the age. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, Jesus defines those as the angels, First, collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. And he associates the burning with weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. And the barn here represents the kingdom of their father. So the disciples knew that this meant more than just the green thumb. And in this case, Jesus explained what it meant. I do want to make sure that there's clarity that in this particular case, that there is a parable that's earlier in the chapter. It's the parable of the sower. This is a different parable than that. There is no, while they use the same characters and reference similar things, they actually represent different things. So as a refresher, the parable of the sower is where the sower is putting seed in different types of soil, and depending on what kind of soil that the seeds fall in, there's a different result as indicated by what type of plant or how long the plant survives as it grows. That is a different parable. That is not the same parable here. In the parable of the sower, the seed actually represents the word of God, and the soil is representing people's hearts. So it is the impact of the word of God on the hearts of people. While in this case, in the parable of the weeds, the seed actually represents the people in the kingdom, and the soil is the world. So it is the people of the kingdom and how they function in the world. So completely different definitions, completely different interpretations. And so these are two different lessons. I just wanted to call out that this is not one and the same parable or a continuation of one. This is a separate lesson. All right, so we kind of called out in the last couple slides what Jesus interpreted. I actually want to spend just a minute or two talking about the things that Jesus didn't define. Not that I'm going to put any special significance on them, as that's not the point of the parable. Parables often only define certain parts of it, and that's because the parts it defines are really important to the central lesson, while the things that Jesus doesn't define just means it's not consequential to the lesson. But it's kind of interesting just to call out. So one of the things, as you could see in the red question marks that are called out in verse 25, it states, "But while everyone was sleeping." And so Jesus doesn't explain whether sleeping was a good or bad thing. Was it an innocent nap? Was it an innocent night's worth of rest? Or were they failing to watch? You know, we've seen and heard other parables. Pastor Jim actually talked about one just last week or recent weeks about people who weren't ready and people who weren't watching. In this particular case, all we know is that people were sleeping, and we shouldn't pass any judgment on it. And in this case, as I mentioned, if Jesus doesn't define it, it means it's not consequential to the lesson, but people were sleeping. And so that's just an interesting thing to call out. In verse 26, you could see that the wheat started to form heads. In some of my research, I was reading that some people were equating this to like worldwide missions, right? When the wheat is sprouting, it's the result of missions. Again, it's not consequential to the point of this story, but interesting to call out that Jesus did not define any significance related to forming of heads. In verse 27, Jesus did not define who the servants were. That's interesting. So actually, a lot of writers were thinking, well, perhaps the servants were the disciples. And in this case, the disciples asked a lot of questions. In this case, the servants were asking questions. Like, I don't know if there's any significance to that, but again, there is not any significance to the importance of the point of this particular lesson. And in the last question mark, you could see as part of the last part of verse 28, it indicates, do you want us to go and pull them up? And so it wasn't really explained exactly what pulling up meant. Some authors believe that the pulling up could mean like premature gathering, which equals like, is this the discipline from the church? And so when you're pulling out the weeds, where the disciples asking, hey, should we actually insert some discipline here? Again, not consequential to the point and lesson of this parable, but interesting to call out. So the modern day parable of wheats and weeds in this time and place is kind of like picking a mask these days, right? So is it an N95 mask? Can you tell the difference between that and a KN 94 mask or a KF94. I don't know. There's a whole alphabet soup of different codes and characters for masks. We generally believe and know that N95s are the gold standard, but we know that there are a bunch of alternatives, but it's not really understood as to whether they're as effective or the ones that you can choose from, like which ones are better and which ones not. There's all these articles you can read about that. But in some ways, it's kind of the modern day equivalent of the wheat and the weeds. And so many people think that the lesson that is part of the wheat and the weeds is really about the difference between the wheat and the weeds. Or, a lot of lessons could be, hey, what do you want to be? Do you want to be a wheat or do you want to be a weed? And in this particular case, I don't believe that that's actually the main lesson point here. While it's important that wheat and weeds are different, and while it's important that you would rather be a wheat than a weed within the context of this parable, the actual main point isn't about what you are, but it's really more about how long the wheat and the weeds will coexist with each other. And so again, it's not about whether you are a wheat or weed, while that is important. The point of this parable is really about how long the wheat and the weeds will coexist. And as you could see on this slide, the answer is right there. In verse 30, it says, let both grow together until the harvest. And so the harvest, again, represents the end of the age. So let's dive deeper into what this lesson means to us. So 3 points. The first point here is that the enemy is at work around you. So again, the point not being about whether you're a wheat or a weed, but it's really about what's happening while the wheat and weeds coexist together. The first point is that the enemy is working around you. And so at this point in time, as Jesus is sharing this parable, he was referencing that an enemy put weeds within the wheat field. And this actually was a common thing that was happening during that time, where people who didn't like each other would actually literally put tares or wheat into the fields to really wreck someone else's harvest. And so not only was this a good example, it was an example that a lot of these people could relate to. So I was actually reading some articles here, and I came across a pretty interesting article about a bunch of families in Canada. And so it was about how a millionaire who died, after he died, actually resulted in influencing a whole bunch of families to have as many babies as possible. And in this case, this happened in Toronto. Toronto is the largest city in Canada. It's in a province called Ontario, and it's more on the eastern side of the country for all of those that don't know Canadian geography here. But way back in 1926, on Halloween, kind of ironic from that perspective, on October 31st, 1926, Charles Vance Miller, who was a well-known Canadian lawyer, passed away at the age of 73. And Miller was someone who really liked to play practical jokes. He didn't have any immediate family that was someone that, or people that he could really kind of pass on his wealth to, or maybe more importantly, there wasn't any family members that he really wanted to pass his wealth to. So he actually started to use his last will and testament as a kind of somewhat of a practical joke. And it ended up being somewhat of a social experiment at the time. So while he was alive, he was pretty famous for doing little pranks, like he'd drop a dollar bill on the side of the road and then he would hide it behind a bush to see like who would actually pick it up. But man, he took it to a whole nother level when it came to his actually last will and testament. So to give you an example of some things that he did. First of all, he had accumulated enough wealth that equals around $10 million today. $10 million in Canadian dollars today is worth around $7.5 million US. Still quite a lot of money. So with the first $1 million that he wanted to give away, he did a couple of things. One of the things is he actually gave a his vacation home in Jamaica, he gave it to 3 people, but these 3 people hated each other with a passion. And his only condition was you only could have this house if all 3 of you promised to own the house. Like as soon as you, one of you gives up on it, then none of you get it. And so that was kind of like one aspect of the practical joke. The other thing was that he had shares towards a horse racing club that he gave and donated to a group of people that were really against gambling. And so, again, kind of an inappropriate gift, that perspective. And then the last thing was that there was a bunch of shares that he had in a brewery, and he gave it to some really religious people who were against drinking. And so you could see that he was really not really that great, I guess, or nice in the way that he was doing this. But he had $9 million left that he wanted to give away. And he started a contest that he said that the day he dies, that in the city of Toronto, whichever woman gave birth to the greatest number of babies between the day he died and 10 years after would actually get the rest of his fortune. I mean, mind you, this was happening during the Depression. So this was like the 1926 to 1936, where there was a lot of suffering, a lot of tough things going on. And here you have someone who is offering, a woman basically $9 million to basically have as many babies as they can. Not really realizing, or maybe he did, and that makes it that much more fortunate, about some of the negative things that could happen from that. So what was kind of interesting is that no one really paid attention to this, quote unquote, they call it the stork race or the stork derby, for the first 6 years. Like, just no one really paid attention to it. But 6 years into the race, the actual government of the province of Ontario decided to nullify the last will and testament and donate all the remaining funds to the University of Toronto. And when the news reported this, then all of a sudden everyone started getting upset about how could the government do this? They're taking away like our rights, all these types of things. And so the government actually had to cancel their decision. And at that point on, the race was on. So there was 4 years left. And so basically, if you were a family that gave birth to a lot of children up to that point, you actually started to consider this time. It's not really known exactly how many families participate in this. It is believed that there was more than 24 families that were actually participating in this race. And by the end of it, there were 6 families that gave birth to 9 children. And there was a lot of a lot of court cases resulting in this, because in some of the cases, like a woman had a child with more than one father. There was others where the child, was born alive but no longer was alive. I mean, there was just a whole bunch of things that went into court cases. So what ended up happening was a group of people settled. That took around another $1 million, and so 4 families were left with to split $8 million across them, so $2 million a family. Some of the sad things that were happening, some of these families were so poor that some of the babies actually died being bitten by like rats that were in their home. And so, again, not a very good outcome. What you're seeing on the screen right now is actually a family picture of one of the winning families from that stork derby. Another example of people being led astray in this case, example of this is a picture of a human hot pot in Hangzhou's First World Hotel, which is in a region of China that actually has some hot springs. They turned one of their hot spring pools into a hot pot. And so they actually put items into the hot spring there. And as you could see, thankfully, people were not cooking their food in the hot spring, but they actually had this big skewer that they basically rolled across the entire pool, and people were just like eating them like animals. In this particular case, I would say a pretty bad decision on the side of on the human side. While this example here isn't to illustrate that the devil likes to eat hot pot by any means, which I'm glad that he doesn't, because I personally like hot pot. But this is, again, an illustration how people can be led to do some pretty outrageous things. And so another example of that here. So yeah, again, as I was stating, I mean, Charles Vance Miller, hot pot, not the work of the devil, but really about showing examples of how people, through incentives and just bad decisions and just temptations even, about how we can actually be influenced in the decisions that we make. In 1990, Elizabeth Newton earned a PhD in psychology at Stanford. And what she was actually studying was she actually played a game. And this game was about tappers and listeners. And so in this case, she provided every tapper. And what a tapper was is that it was someone who was knocking on a table, the rhythm of a song. And so there were 25 songs that the tapper could choose from. And on the other side of the table was a listener. And so the listener was supposed to guess the name of the song being tapped. If we had more time, I'd actually play this game with you today. But due to the lack of time, you could try this at home and see whether it works or not. What ended up happening was 120 of these songs were tapped. And the listeners all had to guess the name of the songs. And they only got it right 2.5% of the time. So only 3 times out of 120 attempts did the tapper actually properly articulate the song to the listener, and the listener actually guessed the name of the song. So why is this worthy of a PhD dissertation? Well, it was because of this one thing, is that she actually asked at the beginning, before the tappers started tapping their songs, like, what do they think the success rate of the listeners' guesses would be? And they guessed that it would be right 50% of the time. So they guessed that 1 out of every 2 times that the listener would actually get the song right. But in fact, they only got it right 1 out of every 40 times. If there was a major disconnect between the tapper's expectation and the actual result of the listener here. And so what does that really have to do with today's lesson? And this whole first point is about that the enemy is at work around us. And it's because, we think we go to church, we pray, we read the Bible. Sometimes we're a little overconfident about how well we can actually discern between the voice of God and the voice of the enemy. And in this case, I think that we may lull ourselves into a state of just being too comfortable. But in reality, the enemy's main goal is to deceive us. The enemy is very intelligent and very capable. And so this is an encouragement here that while we are putting our attempts forward to really discern and listen to the difference between God's voice and the enemy's voice, that it is very difficult. So that leads us to our second point here. And this is recognizing that life is hard. And in this case, it just states, no wonder life is so hard. And it's because the parable explains that Jesus said that let the wheat and the weeds grow together until the harvest. And so the fact that the wheat and the weeds are together actually is the explanation as to why life is so hard here on earth. And so, we'd like to think that that when you become a Christian, that life gets easier. But we know that that's not true. So, bad things happen. Your car breaks down, or you get into an accident. You don't really have the money to repair it. You get laid off. A family member gets really sick, and everyone can't agree on what to do in that particular case. Some of you, I know, have experienced family members who have gotten COVID. That's rough. Maybe your house roof is leaking, or maybe you're not getting along with your siblings. Perhaps really people who are really close to you are getting divorced, and in this case, maybe you care for both of them, but they're making you choose, like which one will you continue to be friends with. Perhaps your kids are having trouble at school. I mean, these are all really tough things that happen. And I guess the illustration or what I'm thinking about here right now is thinking about like a pinball game. And in this pinball game, you have the pinballs that are made of wheat and the pinballs that are made of weeds. And they're bumping into each other and they're just creating havoc. And that's creating a lot of trouble in your life. And so, of course, that makes your life hard. And it doesn't get any easier the older you get or the more Christian that you feel like you're becoming. And so while the Bible is actually quite comforting, there's a lot of verses in there that comfort you in these difficult times. And especially like in the book of Psalms, where there's a lot of encouragement. I just want to just call out for this point that you shouldn't be correlating the ease in life with how Christian or how religious you are, that there actually really is no correlation there. And it kind of leads us to the question that a lot of people always ask is like, why do good things happen to bad people? And why do bad things happen to good people? And I think there's a lot of innocence in this question, that when people are asking it and they really just want to know what is happening there. But the reality is that the answer of why good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people, and I know we cringe when we actually see good things happening to bad people, is because of this part of the parable. In point 1, it already said that the enemy has sowed weeds, and those weeds are not there to make your life easy. It's there to make your life hard. But the other one is because of this point where the weeds and the wheat are coexisting, and that they will coexist until the harvest time. And that kind of takes us to our third point here, as far as what that day will be. It'll be really clear as to what day that will be. In verse 30, the second part of it says, "At that time I will tell the harvesters," which are the angels, "first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned," again tied to weeping and gnashing of teeth, "then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn, which is the kingdom of their Father." The actual word burned in here is the same word burn that is found in Daniel chapter 3, verse 6, which is referring to the fiery blazing furnace. It's actually the same words there. So very serious, very, a pretty aggressive term there. So the weeds and the wheat will be determined at that particular point in time. And so I was thinking about just in my own life, like what is something that I could tell the difference between something that's authentic versus not. So I want to show you a picture of a really, really famous hockey card. And so I know that many of you aren't hockey fans, so I think many of you will become hockey fans now that Seattle is going to have a hockey team. But there's a man named Wayne Gretzky, who some of you may have heard of, who is arguably the best hockey player of all time. In the same way that people kind of argue who the best basketball players of all time, and there isn't consensus, but generally speaking, I think more people than not believe it's Michael Jordan. Wayne Gretzky is the equivalent of like the Michael Jordan of hockey. So he's long retired, and he leads in many categories. If any of you in the business world have heard the term, skate to where the puck is going, not to where the puck actually is, that's actually a reference to something that Wayne Gretzky did really well. He just always seemed to know where the puck was going. And so this that you see here was his rookie card that was printed in 1979, and did a little bit of research on how you tell the difference between a fake card and an authentic card. So the first thing, I've actually numbered them on the screen here. Number 1 is actually the edges. So back in the 1970s, they would cut the edges of hockey cards with a wire. And so as that wire started to cut against the cardboard that it was cutting against, like it would never really make a perfect sharp cut like a paper cutter would or some sort of like blade. And so over time, the cards actually had really rough edges. And so if you see a rookie card of Wayne Gretzky that has really sharp edges, it's probably a fake because in reality, it has rough edges. Number 2, on his left shoulder, there's actually a yellow dot. And so all authentic rookie cards have this yellow mark on it. Number 3, the brand that was most desired was the brand that was printed in Canada. It was a brand called O-Pee-Chee. In the US, it was printed under a brand called Topps. And I think some of you are familiar with the brand Topps with baseball cards and things like that. But it's the O-Pee-Chee brand that actually was more desired. And the last one is that, number 4, is that the hockey card was actually translated into both English and French. And so the card needed to have French in it, and the American version did not have French on it. Only the Canadian version had it. So actually, I have one of these cards. I have it right here. This card, 1979, I got it several years after it was printed. I actually was 12 years old at the time in 7th grade, and I actually bought the card for $10. And so this was several years after it came out, but I was able to find one for $10. How much is that card worth today if it was in mint condition? There actually was an auction that was done in Atlantic City in 2016, and this card in mint condition sold for $465,000. It was actually believed to be, it could go for over $500,000. It fell short of that, but it actually was, it went for $465,000, one that was in mint condition. Now, I have to tell you before all of you start trying to break into my house that this card is not in mint condition. In fact, it has folds all over the place, and it actually was crumpled up in a ball when I got it. Like, remember, I bought this as a 12-year-old from another 12-year-old who found this card like in their couch, and so it was given to me like in a ball. And so in reality, this card is probably still worth only $10. But what I wanted to call out in the picture of the actual auction is that you can see right next to it that on Etsy today that it clearly you could see that you could buy a printed reprint of this for $4.69. And so there's actually quite a difference. But you know, these reprints don't have all those things that I just kind of stated that it had. There's this game show that's on right now. It's called I Can See Your Voice. And I know earlier I said I don't watch that many TV shows, but this is one that's actually been kind of interesting for our family. And what it is that there's this game where there are 6 people that the contestant has to choose from. They have to find out which ones are the good singers and which ones are the bad singers. And they do this based just on looks. And so they actually have to determine, you know, does singer A have a good voice or a bad voice, just based on the way that they're dressed and the way that they are holding themselves on stage. And for every correct answer they get is $10,000. For every wrong answer they get $0. And so they're trying to use their skills to identify who the imposters are to win money. And this kind of relates to this time of harvest. Actually, it related in my own mind about what is happening here. And it was talking about how the wheat and the weeds will be determined at the time of harvest. And in this case, like the game show, at the end of the game, at every episode, like everyone has to sing, and you actually do realize like who the good and the bad singers are. But in the same way, the wheat and the weeds will be differentiated at that time as well. Now, this isn't like in the game you celebrate when someone's right and when they're wrong. In this particular case, I mean, this is not a time for celebration. The wheat and the weeds, in this particular case, like the consequence at this point of time at the end of age during the harvest is actually like a bad outcome in this particular case. It does state that the bundles of the weeds will be burned, weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so this is the unfortunate reality. And so I don't want to lighten the main point of this by equating it to this game show. The main takeaway from the game was just that it will be clearly revealed at the end who is who. So what can we do about this? I guess this kind of takes us to our last section here about application. And so I generally use 2 illustrations, probably every other opportunity I have to share a message. And in this case, it's been 2 years. And so I'm going to be sharing the same 2 illustrations as I usually do in this particular case, so please bear with me. But perhaps it just kind of illustrates how relevant that these two illustrations are. And so the first one is, before I walk into it, I just kind of want to call out that for those of you that don't know whether you are wheat and you desire that you want to be wheat, we really encourage you to either connect with Pastor Jim, talk to any of the deacons, talk to any of the elders that are at our church, and we're happy to spend as much time as you want to kind of walk through exactly what it means to be a wheat and how you know that you are a wheat. But for those of you that claim to be a wheat, let's kind of look at this particular graphic on the screen here. So in this particular case, what it is saying is that as the wheat grows in maturity, in this particular case, the way that you know that you're growing is that you really begin to understand the difference between God's holiness and your sinfulness. And so, we were joking a little bit before this service that the sinfulness arrow is pointing directly to me. That wasn't intentional, part of this video, but in reality, it's actually quite appropriate in the sense that I myself am a sinner. And so I do belong on this side of the arrow as opposed to the other side of the arrow. But the sign of maturity is the growing understanding of how wide apart God's holiness is from our sinfulness. And as I pointed out in years past, this is not to indicate that as time goes on, that God becomes more holy and we become more sinful. Rather, is as time goes on and you mature as a Christian, that you really start to understand the difference. And that difference starts to widen as far as your understanding, not the actual reality. And so the analogy that I want to use as far as the growing, as far as maturing in your faith is like a long jumper. And so let's say that early on in your Christian walk that you believe that life is basically a long jump contest, and that the goal of the long jump is to jump as far as you can. That's what you think that the actual contest is about. And so you start to compare yourself to small kids who can't even walk. And you're like, wow, I could jump farther than them. And then all of a sudden you see like an Olympic long jumper and you go, wow, this person could jump really far. So you start feeling really bad about yourself. And so in your early phases of your Christian walk, you believe it's really about jumping farther, and it's relative to those that could jump really far and relative to those that can't jump really far at all. But as you start to read the Bible, as you start to pray, as you start to get support and counseling from other believers, your understanding of the actual rules of the game differ. And in this case, it's not about how far you could jump, but rather the goal for God's rules is that you need to jump across the Grand Canyon. And so as your understanding of the rules start to become more clear, you start to realize that comparing yourself to a baby or to a small child or to an Olympic long jumper actually is way short of actually what the whole intent of the game is, which is to leap across the Grand Canyon in a single jump. And so it actually kind of changes your whole perspective on what that is. And that's what I'm talking about here, as far as you being wheat and wanting to grow and sprout and really differentiate from the weeds that are out there while the weeds are coexisting with you. It's really understanding about the difference between how sinful you are and how God is. And as you grow in that, that gap actually widens as far as your recognition of what that is. The other point that I want to call out, again, in a very familiar story that I share often, is making sure that as this life that we're in is confusing, and that the enemy is at work, and that the weeds that the enemy has sowed are in place, that how do we stay on the right path? And how do we keep Jesus as the true north, or the source of truth for us, as we use him as the GPS for our life? And the story that I've shared multiple times is a story about Elder David and myself driving home some students from that were all going to the Green River Community College several years ago when we had several students from there attending our church. And I didn't know the Auburn area very well. And so after one of the meetings that we had where we were just hanging out for dinner with the students there, most of them needed rides home. And so I basically told David that I would follow him because I didn't really have any clue as to where I was going to go, and that I trusted his sense of direction more than mine. And so I told him I was going to follow him. So I knew what kind of car he had. And so I started to follow him. And as we were on the freeway, he started to speed up. And he started to go way faster than the speed limit was. And I didn't really know what it was. I just assumed that perhaps someone in the car needed to use the restroom, or maybe there was some reasonable explanation as to why he was starting to drive faster. Not only did he start driving faster, but he actually started weaving in and out of the traffic. And he started to move from one lane to the other and going back. And I was having a lot of trouble keeping up with him, frankly. And so I know at the beginning I said I didn't really know where I was going. I mean, I had a small sense of an idea. And some of the students that were in the car were saying, this exit that's coming up is our exit. We need to exit here if we want to make it to their place. And so I basically made a last second decision to basically move from the left lane of the freeway all the way through the exit. Not a very safe decision, but there weren't many cars on the freeway, thank goodness. And so I decided to just swerve off the side of the road and said, David, you're a crazy driver. I don't know where you're going, but good luck. I mean, hopefully we'll meet there at some point in time. And I exited the freeway. And at that time, as I started to exit the freeway, I looked in my rearview mirror and I saw David, in his car. He was actually behind me, not in front of me. So while I thought that David was the wild driver, and I was trying to keep up with David and not really pay attention to where I was going, and I was being led astray in some ways. In fact, I was actually leading David astray because at some point I lost track of who he was, and I followed another car that actually was the same car as his, and ended up having David follow me. And he probably was thinking, why is this crazy maniac driving the way he is, and putting everyone in harm's way to take these. I'm sure he was thinking some of these kids are never going to come back to our church ever again because they're trying to teach us some sort of sick lesson or something like that. But in reality, it was very easy for me to lose my anchor, or in this case, my reference point. In this case, because there's weeds and wheat in the world at this time, it is very easy for us to lose our way. And unfortunately, as we kind of noted, there are some pretty dire consequences. And so how do I invest in this? It's the Bible, the prayer, it's the church community. If you make investments in these three areas, you will begin to really solidify your anchor there. And so the last point that I just want to make here before we close in prayer is related to how we should love the weeds that are among us, at this time. It's not specifically addressed within the parable or Jesus's interpretation about what we do in the meantime. It's really more of a warning about what is happening with the weeds and the wheat together here. But in this particular case, I think the main point, if we were to build off of that, is that we can't tell the difference. And so we shouldn't be spending our time right now trying to decipher who the weeds and the wheat are, because frankly, we're going to get it wrong. Just like in that tapping game, where only 1 out of every 40 songs were guessed appropriately, or every time I watch I Could See Your Voice, I'm always wrong as to who the good and the bad singers are. And while that's a fun outcome, in this particular case, this is serious stuff. Really playing the game and trying to figure out who the wheat and weeds are not what we should be doing, because we're not good at it, and it's not our role in this life. And so in some ways, I think that again, this is not within the parable itself, but I think one of the reasons why God may allow bad things to happen to good people and allow good things to happen to bad people is actually to remind us that the game's not over. Like, let's not assume that just because the weeds and the wheat that are sowed out there, that someone's on the wrong side of that wheat-weed equation, that people can't change. And we know that that's the truth. So we should continue to love others around us, even if we believe that they're weed, like a weed, or represent the weeds. We should continue to love them. We should continue to invest in their lives, and we should continue to try to share God's love with them. And so, again, praying, reading the Bible, and investing in your community is the way that we can continue to do that. So appreciate your time, but let's close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time that we could gather together, and we understand that every one of your parables has a single main point that you're trying to teach us, and that this main point is that the weeds and the wheat will coexist, until the time of harvest, and that gives us perspective about how we should be living our lives today, that we shouldn't be so casual and loose about it, that we need to realize that we really need to invest and really stay connected to you through the actual time that the harvest comes. And so we really just pray that we can dedicate our lives to you, and we just thank you for this time that we could be together. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Well, thank you, everyone. It's great to virtually be with you in probably your living rooms and such, and we will hopefully see each other soon. Thanks.